Greetings to all. We would like to thank you for joining us for the 38th edition of the Annual Investment Meeting webinar series. My name is Karen Bison and I'll be your MC for today. The Annual Investment Meeting is the largest investment platform in the world, an initiative of the UAE Ministry of Economy. AIM has been promoting a healthier global economy by linking investment opportunities to fast-growing economies under 6 key pillars: foreign direct investment, foreign portfolio investment, small and medium enterprise, startups, and future cities, with a special event, One Belt, One Road. We would like to thank our knowledge partners, GDP Global Frost and Sullivan Global and Civata Global for partnering and developing this webinar. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you experience any issues with your audio or video during the webinar, just refresh your browser and that should take care of everything. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the question tab in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. During the webinar, we'll be running live polls on the right side of the chat wall, and we request you to participate by casting your votes. The topic for today's webinar is Disruptive Technologies, FDI, Drones, and Urban Air Mobility. This session will discuss disruptive technologies and related prospects for domestic and foreign direct investment, trend forecasting, autonomous vehicles, understanding how industries and markets, civil, commercial, and military can grow and become more efficient, urban air mobility, and operations from small unmanned air system missions to urban air taxi networks and intercity services, prospects and issues for enabling the introduction of safe, profitable, environmentally responsible UAE and cities and worldwide. And today's webinar, we're joined by Mr. Aman Panu, Vice President of Aerospace Defense and Security Team of Frost & Sullivan Global. Over 20 years of professional experience, of which for the last decade, plus Mr. Aman has led market advisory services and strategic analysis engagement across the aerospace, defense, and security sector. Next in the panel is Mr. Andrew Charlton, Director General of Civata Global. Mr. Andrew is the founding director of General Civil Air Transport Associations and Trade Association for the Advanced Air Mobility sector, bringing together cities, local authorities, and different industries in a single global community. And the third speaker is Mr. John Hanna, Director of GDP Global. Mr. John is one of the leading consultants in economic development and promotion. He provides strategic support to clients of national, regional, and city-based trade and investment promotion agencies, or IPAs, special economic zones, and trade ministries worldwide. And so I would like to call Mr. Aman. The floor is yours.
Karen, thank you so much for that. Start with sharing my screen. Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever part of the world you are. So today, what I'll be talking about in terms of complementing this whole chain of discussion that we're having with the likes leaders in the sector like Andrew Charlton and John, and is to focus on the demand side of things. Let's fast forward our minds a bit here. Okay, let's look at 2020 XX. I would like to say 25 rather than 35. Okay. But let's fast forward our minds a bit. Imagine an environment where the vehicle is ready, tested and certified. The ecosystem is resilient, network infrastructure, civil infrastructure is all in place, certified. The regulations are set. Yep, I do believe they will be. And the app is available for us to, if I may use the term, Uber call our next flight for the next journey we are going to take. And the price, well, fits our bill. Okay. Will you get on board? Okay, so this is a very, very important question. And this is what we started with thinking about when we conducted this very wide kind of study where we really went right to the customer, you and me, who are the people who are going to be saying, hey, I am going to use air taxis in the future to displace my existing traditional modes of how I commute in my day-to-day life. Okay, whether it's for work, whether it is for any other application with family or commuting for airport shuttles, etc., whatever it is. The question really comes in is it just going to be a good concept? And there are many that are underway currently and have been in the past also, or is it actually going to be a viable business? And that was the key question we were trying to answer there. Okay, so Are you going to get on board? Are people really, the citizens of cities, really going to get on board? And is it going to be a viable business? But before we start into something like this, aero taxis, urban air mobility, advanced air mobility, multiple terminologies you can look at it from, is quite a complex ecosystem. One thing for sure, it's only going to be successful when collaborative solutions come into place, when collaboration happens right across the value chain. Okay, there'll be a vertical and horizontal integration almost mandatory for the success of something like this to be fielded within our skies. Okay, so this is a simpler view of the things, but collaborate to operate is the key message that we want to take to everyone. And this is something that really needs to be thought about. So from our perspective, a lot of questions need to be answered, but really looking at the demand landscape, the first question that came to our mind was, so where are these, this kind of futuristic, more advanced transportation capability, really, where are they going to be hosted? Where are they going to be the first kind of use cases being flying around and establishing commercially kind of viable operation within those skies? So the location was the question. The next point really comes in the perception, and the willingness of the people to really displace their existing habits using an air taxi. Okay, their willingness to pay a certain price point for that premium service in many ways, but actually, really defining what that purpose and price kind of is going to fit into. What are they going to use it for commuting day to day so that they can reduce the travel time or the convenience of that? Or are they going to use it for very niche applications, moments when they're going for family kind of outings or specific journeys, inter or intra-city for that matter of fact? And what's the kind of frequency we are really looking at? How would that really translate from a premium service to really achieving the economies of scale that this becomes an integral part of our commuting and our transportation habit in the future? Okay. So what we did was to answer this question on the the location part of it. We at Frost & Sullivan have got a comprehensive coverage of what we call the smart mobility tracker, where we've got dozens of parameters that we measure these cities actively on to really see the maturity of their digital and their civil infrastructure and their policies towards a robust and connected kind of city environment. Now, the reason to focus on smart cities is, as mentioned, it's a complex capability. You're talking about merging the worlds of our day-to-day transportation with aviation element of that, and really flying that, within visibility for us and within reach for us. So it is very, very important that there's a certain degree of maturity in the infrastructure that hosts these kind of capabilities within the cities. So we focus on the smart cities because they meet the credentials to a far degree in terms of having that infrastructure in place that can be brought to service for a capability like this. Okay. When we looked into these cities, we measured them across 60 parameters, both from transport habits perspective, the infrastructure maturity perspective, but also from an aerospace credentials perspective. Measuring those across a multitude of data points that we created, we were able to establish a certain kind of scoring for each of those cities to see which of these cities are most attractive to host UAM within their skies. We came up with the top 10 cities, and I'll talk about that a bit later, but largely what we did from there on was we wanted to get a global perspective. The top 10 cities, no prices there for anyone on that one. I'm pretty sure many of you would be able to just take those names and you'd be far near in terms of what those cities have come up in terms of our listing. But it's the regionally balanced kind of view we wanted to take. We wanted to know about cities in Africa. We wanted to know that, hey, the Chinese perspective was taken into account. It's going to be a significant market there. We want to know the diversity in Asia Pacific, Middle East as a market, but also Latin America. So we wanted to cover that entire ecosystem, including Europe, to give a very regionally balanced view. So what we did was, out of all the rankings, the top 5 cities for each region, we then selected 12 cities, which gave a very diverse kind of view of the world in terms of the population, the transportation habits, the infrastructure mix, and their current kind of readiness to that. So within those 12 cities, we went out and conducted extensive 5,000 surveys. I'm hoping that some of you on this call probably were a part of those surveys, and hopefully you brought in your perspectives to it. But what we were testing was your perception. your willingness to get on board when that service was going to be fully ready as we were defining it previously. So, but also your willingness to pay a certain price point, okay, for certain journeys, specific journeys that you would displace using air taxis, and your overall perspective on the operations is something that you want to take right, from point to point in front of your door, or you're willing to walk 6 to 10 minutes to the closest vertiport and be able to leverage that network of small vertiports that creates that infrastructure that will be required to service the requirements and the demand that we see. But also from a supply perspective, it was equally important to see that, yeah, people are willing to do that. Okay, if their perceptions are favorable, what are the perceptions of the supplier world, of the stakeholders in the value chain in terms of the readiness of the technology itself, the perception of where these will be used the most and for what? But importantly, what is that cost per flight hour which will really deliver an operationally and commercially viable, a profitability threshold, if I may say, for this service to be achieved, so that you could have a viable business there. So a lot of these questions came in, but let me go straight in here. Is your city ready? These are 12 cities that we really took in the regionally balanced view of the world that we were looking at. The ones that in the red you're looking, of course, as I mentioned, some of the natural kind of right up there kind of cities. Dubai, of course, is standing strong. London emerged at the top end in terms of cities that are perceived to have the highest readiness to be able to host in terms of this capability, in terms of their infrastructure, their readiness in the mindset, and etc. So there's the compendium of it. Your city, out of those 100 cities we are talking about, is sitting somewhere there also, no matter where in the world that you are. If not, we can look into that. But what I you'd like to draw attention, and I'm sure you all are looking at the high potential there, but you're also looking at Singapore. Wow. Are the citizens not really ready for that? What does this mean for Singapore? What we are not saying is that this doesn't mean that Singapore is not going to be successful in terms of hosting this capability. And if anything else, actually the infrastructure is right there. You can see where they're plotted in terms of the transportation habits and the aviation score that they've got. They're right up there. Everything is in place. But what this indicates is that from a transportation habits perspective, but also from a perspective of the citizens' perceptions today of whether they need this service or not, there needs to be a lot of work put in terms of increasing that awareness of the value proposition something like this is going to bring in. Of course, when you look at Tokyo, there's an aging population. I'll talk to you here where, when we looked at most of the surveys we conducted, nearly half of their citizens, what they said was, hey, I definitely or probably use air taxis for my transportation kind of habits that I'm using other modes of transportation today, whether it's my personal car to the metro, to the bus network, whatever it is, right? But specifically speaking, and I'm risking coming very close to the age bracket of 50 now, okay? But people over 50 were the least likely to use air taxis. What does this mean? Actually, fast forward this about 10 years from now, where we think that actually that's when the capability will start becoming a bit more accepted and there'll be many more use cases already in place, operationally speaking. Majority of the population customer target group that you're looking at actually is going to be having favorable perceptions. So actually that is much more positive. So you fast forward 10 years, you're looking at a population base which has got much more confidence and into this kind of technology and willingness to actually pay for it and get on board this thing. But of course, what drives people to really think about whether they're going to use an alternate mode of transportation or not? What's the reasons for that? Well, when we asked all of these people, the top end of that, not surprisingly, was travel time. Okay. Comfort was another thing. I traveled into the city in London, and sometimes you feel like a bit of sardines in the morning, and when you miss 3 or 4 kind of tubes at Waterloo Station before you can head up to your destination, it's a bit overwhelming. Okay, not exactly the start of the day you really want for yourself. So travel time, comfort, they are some of the reasons that people select there. But inhibitions in their mind, and this is before we ask them, what price are they willing to pay for it, both prompted and unprompted. When we reached that stage kind of things, was high price. Everyone's mind was high price, okay? And let's break it down from a technology perspective. When we spoke to the stakeholders, the value chain stakeholders there, the biggest kind of market entry barrier, if you may say, the technical barrier was emerged to be battery energy density limitations. Now, again, that's not very surprising, but when you have likes of Elon Musk putting in their weight and conviction behind saying, hey, by 2024, we are looking at achieving that 600, circa 600 kind of watt hour per kg kind of density ratio, which will fit in the requirements of the aviation sector, you start taking confidence because the ripple effect of that is immense. Now, in the short term, this is likely going to be at best a hybrid solution we are going to be looking at. But when we move towards alternate fuels or electric kind of propulsion solutions within that environment, you're talking about immense benefits from an environmental standpoint of view. You're talking from sustainability perspective, and you're talking about economic viability perspective eventually. So it's going to be a win-win as we overcome that kind of challenge. But currently, there's a bit of work to be done, and that's one of the areas to be looked at. Okay. So moving forward here a bit, we've got a bit about perceptions and all. So I spoke about how much people are going to be willing to pay, etc. Well, the range is quite wide, but bottom line, what I can tell you is that when we looked at the cost per flight hour, which the value chain stakeholders defined to us would be necessary to achieve a profitable operation for such a capability, right across all the cities we look at, the average price they were indicating was above that threshold. So what I want to conclude there is that, hey, this is an attractive business to get into, and it is likely to become one that is going to prove commercially and operationally viable. So I'm going to stop here just quickly that there is a poll option that you have. You can go into the poll section and give your own views to that. I know Andrew Charlton, I was going to talk later, has a view that if his travel time was halved, he's willing to pay twice the amount of the taxi cost he pays for a similar journey. What is your answer to that? So please, you're invited to take your poll. It'd be very interesting to see your views. At the bottom left here, what you see is we actually expanded when we looked at the implementation of this technology and service within our cities. We expanded it from 100 to 175 cities actually. And by 2030, though we are just looking at about 8 cities which are expected to realize those kind of initial operations, by 2040, there'll be a significant leap there. But it's the decade beyond 2040, we believe that there would have been enough use cases in place and buy-in and maturity in technology and the operations itself that would trigger incremental leap there. And the decade in 2040 is going to see the rest of the 175 cities go live with this capability. A big number, 2.7 trillion in 2040, roughly about 90 odd billion of it. This comes from OEM revenues, and the rest of it is from service revenue of you and me paying the price per journey for something, accessing something like this. Okay, we already know that that fits the bill in terms of the dollar value, in terms of what we are willing to pay. Okay, that's computing to an astounding 2.7 trillion in 2040. We're looking at about 300 to 400,000 vehicles to be fielded in 2040 alone. And this is going to vary. Vehicles, by the speed of the vehicle, the kind of turnaround times, fueling times, etc. Many dynamics are going to change and evolve in time to come. But the key message here is it is a sizable opportunity. Okay, it is going to change the way we commute. It is going to change the way the industry is structured today. Okay, both from automotive sector perspective and the aviation sector, because you're really bringing two worlds together and two kind of supply chain mindsets together to deliver a service. Okay, so of course Dubai is, and probably not very surprising, we anticipate Dubai will go live with the initial capability by 2025, close on heels with some of the regulations falling in place. And London, though it emerges at the top end in terms of its perception of being ready to host the city, actually is likely to be in early 2030s, alongside cities like Paris, etc. Okay. To just conclude a few points over the next few slides, we're looking at a hybrid kind of solution to be fielded, both for 2 and 4 passenger kind of options. Initially, it's expected, and larger of the population said they expect it to be piloted, but optionally piloted vehicles is probably going to be the starting point. It's a network of small vertiports. We're not talking about centralized hubs only, because to meet the kind of habits of people today, the best option is to go with a network of small vertiports. Intercity is likely to come in before intracity, and that's a lot to do with kind of certifications, etc., that are expected to be less complex in that side of the things. And similarly, so cargo transport is likely to actually be the first few kind of services that are becoming and followed closely with some special mission kind of services, including emergency medical services and things like that. Okay. The platform, we highly recommend should be a modular platform which can switch between cargo operations and passenger operations. Now that's difficult to achieve, but that is going to give the maximum kind of return on investment and sustainable operations for any operator within that ecosystem. Of course, we'll have to focus on some of the key things like a unified digital infrastructure, which is going to be absolutely instrumental in terms of the success of a resilient and robust operation of this kind of capability. And I have to say that today we all talk about regulation from an aviation perspective. We really need to start talking about that inclusive of the infrastructure itself. Who's going to certify the resilience of that infrastructure within that mix? Who's going to own that decision and that regulation, etc. And of course, then you've got the collaboration element of it, which is absolutely critical to achieve. I'm going to leave this with a thought that, hey, urban air mobility is just one application. There are many more applications here. And actually, I'm going to invite you to another poll here, if you can take a moment to really share your views on which of these applications are going to be the most beneficial for your city, for you as an individual, as a community. Thank you. Passing on to Andrew.
Indeed. And good morning, good afternoon, greetings to everyone. Thanks very much for coming along, and thanks very much, Aman. That was a seriously interesting and valuable presentation. And I'm still trying to get over two things in your statistics, or they're both of them numbers. 2.7 trillion is quite a large number. There's no getting around that. But secondly, you may be approaching 50. That number is more than a decade behind me. So obviously I'm never going to use these services, which is obviously a little bit problematic for someone in my position. Ladies and gentlemen, let me start by very quickly, as Karen very kindly pointed out, Savata Global aims to bring together in exactly the way Aman spoke, that sort of collaborative approach between the industry manufacturers, and also local government authorities, whether they're cities or regions or whatever, to exactly address the concerns that Aman brought up. And I think what he said was completely on point and very valuable, and something that I know John too will talk about to some extent. I think Aman made the case really very well that there is demand for these services. And I actually think that if you go backwards a step from that, there's already clearly demand and clearly interest in unmanned, let me call them drone services for want of a better word, cargo carriage, those sorts of things, whether we're talking the really important role of getting vaccines to where they need to be as quickly as possible, or whether we're talking, yes, the very important role of getting pizzas to where they need to be very quickly. We are already seeing really quite interesting applications in drones, in unmanned vehicles, mainly used for cargo. It's a quantum leap again to take an unmanned vehicle to the point where it carries humans, because you are abutting there very, very obviously. You are abutting the aeroplane interface, and aeroplanes are something which for more than 100 years we've been really good at regulating. And by really good, I mean very safe, I mean very reliable. And we've done that through a really rigorous process whereby all of the money that needs to be spent to get the aircraft certified is spent before one aeroplane is sold. We go around and around, and we certify, and we go back and we test, and there are all sorts of safety limitations and safety requirements built into that system. But we stand at a really interesting point now in history, because for the first time we have, I think, three groups of people interested in these new vehicles in a way that, frankly, the system blew out anybody other than the four obvious: Boeing, Airbus, Embraer and Bombardier. And there's a Russian builder, there's a Chinese builder, but frankly, you can count them on your fingers how many aircraft manufacturers there are in the world for all intents and purposes. In the UAM space, in the urban aerial mobility space, we've got three channels, if you like. The first channel are those aeroplane manufacturers, and Airbus in particular has been right at the forefront of this sort of urban aerial mobility, although it has to be said Boeing is a long way down the road in unmanned aviation per se, albeit that would be aviation up in controlled airspace. The second group, of course, are the startups, Volvo, Copter, Lilium, Joby, and for a while Uber, but Uber's now been taken over by, or Uber's Elevate program has been taken over by Joby. And they are classic startups. And then the third group is another really interesting group, and that is the automation, the automobile people, Hyundai, Toyota, General Motors. These guys are coming into this market. And exactly as Aman said, these guys bring a different mentality to bear. For electrical goods more generally, which are just as dangerous if you build them wrong. I mean, if you plug something in and you electrocute yourself, that's quite dangerous. If you plug something in and you black out the entire city, that's also quite dangerous. So there are safety issues not only in aeroplanes, although we've chosen to treat aeroplanes the way that we do, but there are equally safety issues in electrical goods, and you don't need me to tell you the safety issues in automobiles. There's about 1 million deaths a year in automobiles. But the way we have taken to regulate and to certify electrical goods and automobiles is we let the market determine it. We let the market get out there, build what they want to build, and then we form standards around the winner from all of that, which is exactly the reverse of the way in which we've done it for aeroplanes up to date. Why am I addressing this at such detail? The answer is because this has a huge impact as to the point that Aman didn't make, I think, terribly much, which is the supply side. I don't question for a moment the demand side. I do think there are 2 or 3 rate determining steps on the supply side, which is to say the manufacturing of this equipment and the manufacturing of these things. And they are doing what needs to be done to encourage the manufacturers to build, to test, to roll out, and ultimately to expand. And then secondly, for everybody, and I mean everybody, to get a clear understanding of what the infrastructure requirements are on the ground, because they are both fundamental points. And they will determine the rollout. On the first point, which is to say where we are at the moment, we have, for completely understandable, but at many levels unfortunate reasons, we have fallen to a position where each of the major manufacturers seems to have selected a city in which they are choosing to go first and to operate and to bring it out. And that's completely understandable, as I say, but I have to say that I think it would have been better, and I mean that nicely, it would have been better if all 3 or 5, however many manufacturers you want to think are going to go down to the end of this race, had decided to use the same city, because that would much more quickly get us to a place where we have the momentum, the requirements met, and for cities to be able to, or for that city and then every other city thereafter, to learn some of the really important points, we'd have got that weight moving, I think, a little bit more quickly. As I say, completely understandably, cities and manufacturers are looking to do it individually, but I really lament the fact that we don't do it as one. However, the second reason why that's important, I think, is it would have allowed us to have a genuine test bed of the sort of infrastructure that we need and the sort of infrastructure that's going to be necessary, which then, exactly as Aman said, comes back down to local government authorities to work out what they do in terms of city planning, what they do in terms of noise, what they do in terms of nuisance, what they do in terms of security and safety. So that would have been very helpful. I also think, frankly, that had we had a number of manufacturers, suppliers working in the same city at the same time, we'd also get over some of the competition law issues, because, and this is a plea to you, when approached, if you're one of the cities Aman identified, please don't allow for any sort of exclusivity. Please don't require that vertiports be technology specific, or more importantly, don't allow them to be brand specific, because that is going to be a very bad place, because we will slow this down, we will dissipate it, we run the risk of losing the momentum and so forth. By way of analogy, imagine if petrol stations, if you drove a BMW motor car, you could only fill your car up at BMW petrol stations. That a ridiculous outcome and clearly not appropriate at all. But we clearly need to go through understanding what that infrastructure is and understanding the procedures and processes that we need. At the moment, on a regulatory side, there are three things to note, I think. The first thing is that if you speak to the Civil Aviation Authority, then of course they think they should be governing this. They wouldn't they? It makes perfect sense for them. As far as they're concerned, it's in the sky. And as a general comment, civil aviation authorities believe they control the airspace from the grass upwards. And even if they don't control it, because by definition, most of these vehicles will fly at under 150 metres or 500 foot, which is known as Class G airspace or uncontrolled airspace. By definition, uncontrolled airspace is uncontrolled, funnily enough. And so we are at a place where some of the issues of how we manage those things is I think, somewhere where local government authorities really need to stand up and really need to join this debate, and join this debate as a matter of some urgency. To date, as a general comment, the regulations that have been written, promulgated, the rules that have been written and promulgated are about the vehicle. They are about the control of the vehicle, the control of the system. They're not about the control of the airspace. And as a general comment, I mean, Karen very kindly introduced me, but she failed to, or she skipped over the fact that I spent 35 years working in aviation. I'm an airline guy. Generally speaking, and I mean this with absolutely no disrespect, in the aviation industry, local government is something we fly over. It's not something we fly through. And so we've never really had to think about what's happening in uncontrolled airspace, 400 foot above the ground. But that's all that local governments get to think about. That's all they're worried about. They're worried about noise. They're worried about the pollution. They're worried about the nuisance. They're worried about security and safety and those privacy, those sorts of things. So now is the time to redefine, or at least to find a collaborative approach to ensure that local government interests are absolutely concerned with the procedures and protocols. It's not necessarily standards being one of those technical words, a term of art in aviation. More important is the procedures and the protocols that we reach, so that we can develop a strong and sensible system. So the first thing, as I said, is to get involved and to start talking about that. The second thing is to make absolutely sure that we know and fully understand some of the infrastructure limitations and issues. And they are going to be exactly as Aman said. Are you prepared to walk for 10 minutes to get to your nearest vertiport, or do you expect a vertiport closer than that? So in other words, we'll need a network of, and I believe the answer is whatever it is. We can't just have one vertiport. That's a bit like the one and only heliport in a city. Helicopters, of course, at one level, a prototype of this sort of technology, but dreadfully noisy, and as a general comment, routed up and down rivers and over main roads to avoid those sorts of issues. And I speak here as someone who lives very close to a hospital and consequently gets to see or gets to hear helicopters at all times of the night and day. But the network of vertiports is also going to require power. And if you put your vertiport on the top of a building, the power's going to have to go all the way to the top of the building, literally to the very top of the building, and it's got to be high power. Furthermore, if it's in a building, by way of example, then passengers or potential passengers are going to need to go through that building without having to sign in and get a card and get logged on and escorted and all those sorts of things. So there's going to need to be unimpeded access to the roof, which will allow for these things to happen, plus all the usual rules about the inverted cone and so on for helicopter clearances and those sorts of things. We'll also need to have rules about some of the other procedural issues, including where you can and can't land, how close to a school, all those sorts of things that, frankly, in the aviation industry, we've never had to worry about in the past. We have a very simple rule in aviation: land at an airport. It's not that hard. Although what is hard is building airports, and vertiports are going to face some of those issues as well if we don't address them preemptively, if we don't address them sensibly, and if we don't help now to start working on getting people to understand that this is the future. The thing, and this is my final point, the thing that I think helps in all of this, and this is that we are actually in a place now where, even if you're not one of the 5 or 6 or 12 cities that Aman mentioned, you can start to get ready for this stuff. You can start to accelerate it. We're starting to see this with drones, with cargo carrying drones. And we're seeing that in 2 ways, both, as I said, emergency deliveries to hospitals of blood supplies and vaccines and so forth, which are time critical, obviously, and clearly that's a good thing. But we're also starting to see it, and pizzas, never let me forget the pizzas, but we're also starting to see it in what I'd like to call the second last mile, not the last mile, but the second last mile. And if you think about companies like Amazon, their concern is not about drones. Their concern is not about unmanned airspace. Their concern is about delivery. And if it's going to be quicker to do it with a boy on a bike, they'll put a boy on a bike and they'll get it done that way. If it's quicker to do it by drones, they'll do it by drone. They are not looking at drones as a service. They're looking at delivery as a service, and drones are just a part of that. But if you can facilitate that, that's terrific. But at the moment, what we're actually seeing, as I said, is not that last mile stuff, but the second last mile. And FedEx is already using unmanned aeroplanes, Cessnas, Cessna 2.8s, as a matter of fact. So small, I mean that nicely, but small aeroplanes that hold about 100 to 150 kilos of luggage or cargo to shift from their hub to, if you like, a secondary hub. What that means for local governments is that if you've got aerodromes, not fully integrated, massive 3,000 foot runway airports, but actually aerodromes, grass strips, small local airports, then there's a real chance that they could be used for a lot of these unmanned aircraft. I should have pointed out, I'm not sure if I did, that the Cessna 2.8s that FedEx are using are pilot free, unmanned altogether. And that's another example of how we're already actually starting to do some of the stuff on the technical side. And so if we can start to use drone deliveries, which have got the same points about needing vertiports, about needing charging, about needing clearance and access and having concerns about privacy and noise and all those other things. If we can start to do that, then we can start to build up some of the things that Aman was talking about, which is to say that we can start to build a better understanding. But I 150% agree. You can tell I work in aviation because I think 150% is a reasonable number. I 150% agree with Aman that a lot of that is actually going to have to be collaborative. It's going to have to be done not just by a city alone or by a manufacturer alone or by a user alone, an Amazon, if you like, alone. So I think really the question is, for you, have you started to think about this yet? Have you started to worry about this sort of stuff? Do you have a program? Do you have an officer who's responsible for this? If you ring a local government around the world at the moment and get to the switchboard and say, I'd like to talk to the person about drones and UAM, please, your phone call could go in a million different directions. So our third survey question for you is your company or body implementing a vehicle program? And if so, how are you doing it? Is it limited? Is it active? And are you doing it in a way that is starting to be a bit more collaborative? So I think with those points, I'll end there and thank you very much for your attention and hand over to you, John.
Thank you very much. Andrew, that's excellent. Very interesting observations on some of the regulations and other matters that really point to whether or not municipalities and city administrations are ready. And I also want to thank Aman for his introduction, especially focusing on urban air mobility in perhaps the biggest cities and perhaps the, shall we say, the most developed cities at the moment. Thank you also, everyone who's participating, for your comments in the poll so far. I can see, maybe just comment on them briefly. If you haven't gone to the polls, please do so before whilst I'm presenting. But I can see that when it comes to whether cities and municipalities are currently involved in any consortia, international consortia for drones and urban air mobility, the answer essentially is no or don't know. So your cities and regions are not yet, or city administrations are not involved yet in international consortia dealing with the issues and opportunities for drones and urban air mobility of this type. Also, the question that Aman put at the beginning about what price would you pay for air taxi services, I can see here that the most popular is the one that I also thought was about right, which is roughly you would be prepared to pay, or could imagine people paying double what they would normally pay for the same taxi journey. Although I do note in the chat that some people feel it's going to be very expensive for a lot of cities to see such urban drone type taxis being supported. And the other question was, is your company or is your public body implementing programs for autonomous vehicles? And I can see here that half of you indicated that no, nothing is happening yet in your company or in your local authority. And in 40%, maybe there is some limited activity. So that's maybe not surprising. It's still pretty early days. And so I'm pleased to join this and talk for a few minutes just to kind of build on what Aman and Andrew have presented on urban air mobility, especially for people transport in and around cities. What I wanted to present here is to talk about urban air mobility, of course, but to also talk about drones in the wider sense and how they're used in smart cities, the urban environment, but also look at drone applications in other settings than simply transport. And then to look at and build on the two components where Aman talked about the demand side, and actually Andrew was talking more about managing the supply side through regulations. I also want to talk about the promotional side and the financing side, and where the use of so-called foreign direct investment, so attracting foreign private businesses to come and invest in your cities and municipalities, where that has a role to play and how that can be stimulated. So applications, we've heard about people transport in and around busy cities. We can see that they're in large congested cities, developed economies where there's a lot of high value business activity or high value, high net worth individuals. We can see that they may well be interested in the service of this very rapid personal aerial service, transport service. That's great. But from a city and a municipal point of view, drones are also being used. They're not that new, but they are rapidly increasing in their use across 3 or 4 key themes. The first one I want to mention is about, of course, transportation in the urban environment. And there's a big move, of course, to improve the quality of the urban environment in terms of managing pollution, and also to make transportation safer than it currently is, and to make it more efficient. And there are lots of smart technologies being used. I've listed, you can see some of them here. And drone technologies, drone solutions have got a role to play. Drones, of course, can help to manage and monitor the real-time traffic situation in the city. They can also be used to look at particular challenges that are taking place. Sometimes they can be used to look at security issues. And of course, unmanned transport solutions, whether they're in public transport, or indeed in private vehicles or taxis and so on. These are going to become increasingly important for cities and city administrators in the future. So there's quite a lot of activity in and around city transportation that will increase and improve the quality of the urban city environment, not just for the individuals that can afford to pay for a private aerial taxi. The second area where drones are being used, and it will only increase as we become a much more digital economy, especially e-government digital economy, is in areas to do with mapping, especially digital mapping of the urban environment. We can see that this is going to be increasingly important for urban planners, but also for those involved in maintenance and monitoring of the urban environment. Of course, it will be used to improve the experience for people living and visiting cities through developing better quality digital maps that can be used and overlaid on lots of different applications. So, for example, the tourism data can be provided much more accurately. Increasingly, the real estate information is provided through digital mapping overlays from public data. Also, augmented reality maps showing further information about the city that's not obvious at first sight, and also maybe anticipating new developments in the cities, presenting a vision for complete urban transformation, the rebuilding of previously industrial areas, transforming of the urban environment into new future uses. All of this will require the use of drone technologies, and the same kind of regulations will need to come into place as for urban mobility, urban air mobility. Another area that we can maybe focus in on is not just the mapping, but is also to talk about improving the general quality of urban life. So the CBD environment, but also the urban environment and even the suburban environment. I wanted to sort of highlight on things like the monitoring of the health environment for people living in the cities. But also, we just touched on a little bit there, Andrew mentioned about the delivery of that sort of logistics, the delivery of packages for offices, but also for home use, whether it's for your pizza or for your medical supplies or for other things. We know that the private sector is very keen to be able to use these kind of services to improve the quality of our environment, maybe even take some of the white vans off the road and use these cleaner solutions as well. All of that, though, requires a lot of technical development, a lot of planning, and also a lot of, well, hopefully not a lot, but sufficient regulatory environment to manage the whole process. Outside the urban environment, there are some other opportunities in leisure and safety. We can see that when we're out and about, maybe enjoying ourselves in the countryside, or as you can see on the left-hand side, we're maybe on the beach. The drones can be used there as well, assuming there is the right kind of regulations to control it. The image on the left is the surf lifesaver of the future, where if you're in difficulty on the beaches, you don't have to have a hunky life boy or life girl coming to rescue you. You can have a drone coming to drop you life rescue equipment. In agriculture, increasingly, whether you're in a developed economy where these are already being used, or in developing countries, we're going to see more and more drone-related technologies to help manage agricultural activity in terms of watching out for the soil conditions of plants and crops, or dealing with pesticides, or dealing with pests and other issues. So agriculture is another area where we can imagine, for those kind of economies, the use of drones will only increase going forward. It's a great opportunity. And even in the industrial and mining sectors, if your economies are involved with those, we know that mining operations are using drones to check out what's going on in challenging situations. But the same goes too in broad and big industrial environments. Drone technologies, again, are a part of the future. So going forward, we can think about some of the implications. We've heard already from Andrew, and also to some degree from Aman. There's a big issue about the municipal regulatory environment that needs to be managed and developed. That, of course, needs inputs from the national authorities as well. And there needs to be a commitment, I think, from municipality leaders and the municipal management towards moving in a constant direction towards improving the city environment. But all of this does require investment. It requires planning in new infrastructure. Where's that going to be financed? How is that going to be financed? So it will often lead to challenges for the municipal leaders, municipal management to manage their budgets. And so this is a great opportunity, we hope, for the public sector purse to be supplemented by inputs from the private sector, because many of these solutions can be supported and implemented quite dramatically by private sector applications. So I wanted just to summarize a few of the points that I feel are challenging for those of you involved in trying to sell your services to municipalities, or indeed if you're working for city and municipal authorities. These are the kind of issues that cause some of the sort of obstructions in making things move forward at a good pace. We can think of, for example, the management. Does the management have the right kind of experience? Does it have enough knowledge to implement some of these drone, urban air mobility and other smart solutions? Finances, of course, it's always a problem. Most city administrations face difficulties with their budgets. Leadership and vision is going to be important. It's going to be important for city mayors and the leaders of the cities, whether they're also in the private sector, to actually show that this is what they believe is the right thing to do. And it will perhaps help to overcome some of the inertia. The most successful cities going forward will be those that have got that vision. You can see some of the other things listed there, which I think will ring bells to you. For example, distrust of new ideas, or paying for some of these improvements. Citizens even of my own city, London, you know, we want improvements, but we're suspicious about our public, our privacy with having some of these new digital solutions. And we certainly don't want to pay extra in our local taxes for them. So that is a challenge, you know, dealing with these very pragmatic issues. So the leadership of the municipal and city administrations is so important. And moving forward, I think they need to show some of these technologies in practice through maybe pilot projects, through demonstration units. And I think when we look to cities in the United States, for example, and also in Asia, this has proven to be a very effective way to bring on board all the stakeholders, including the public, in these solutions for the future. So the last slide I wanted just to highlight, most important, where do we get the money for all of these things? Of course, at a national level, it does place quite a demand at a national level to invest in these digital and disruptive technologies of the future. Drones and drone-related technologies they're not going to go away. They are part of the future. So it does require a national commitment. And of course, we appreciate in developing economies and least developed countries, you know, this kind of technology is real space age stuff. It may be very difficult for governments of developing and emerging economies to really prioritize this. The next is to understand whether it's possible to raise the levels of municipal debt. Can municipalities raise finance? Are they allowed to raise finance to transform their urban environments using these technologies with paybacks over the next 30 to 50 years? That is not always going to be possible. In some developing countries that may be on this call, I've seen a few of you in the chat, using international sources of funding from multilateral bodies, bilateral. These sources of funds are excellent, and I would seriously encourage you all to try and use them towards looking at projects, feasibility studies, to use this technology to not only introduce drones, but in areas that you can find help your economy straight away. And then the next few options listed there are where the private sector can get involved through maybe PPP arrangements, and also through concessions for particular services in the urban environment. And of course, there is a role for sponsorship, even advertising using drone technologies. These don't always have to be funded directly through services to the municipal authority. They can be chargeable services, of course, like the taxi environment, where the public is paying for those services. And so as a city promoter, as a municipal promoter, if you have the vision, if you have a good understanding of what you can do in the next 3 to 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, then go out there and add this to your investment promotion messages in order to attract foreign direct investment from some of the private sector players in and around the world. So at that point, I'm going to stop. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to pass back now to Karen to open up for any Q&A in the last part of the webinar. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. John. I guess you can receive these questions in the chat box. Would you like to address them, or I will start maybe addressing them? Yeah, would it be fine? Let me just see. Yes, so we have the first question from poll result. I think this is the poll result questions. So let me check the questions. Okay. First question, would it be feasible to have air taxis in our cities? It's an innovative mobility solution, but for an average user, will find it quite expensive.
So I'll take that. When we've gone into the communities and the cities and asked this question, the price threshold that they're talking about actually is telling a different story. What they're willing to pay is meeting the threshold quite notably so that the suppliers are saying they would need for a profitable business. So, you know, the twice the amount or thrice the amount, whatever that amount comes down to, is proving to be acceptable. And I think you'll be surprised what that price level is. You know, a lot of people are thinking, oh, you know, I'm going to pay $500 for something like that. That's not the number we're looking at. You saw the range we had presented to you. So it's not going to be as expensive as you think.
I also think, if I could add in there, I think it's horses for courses, isn't it? You know, and the other issue that you've got to factor in is not just price, but convenience and speed. If a journey in an air taxi is half the time it takes on a road taxi, then the price point moves.
Yeah, Aman, maybe I can ask you, when you did your extensive benchmarking study of cities, can I ask you, did you see...
the connection is unstable, yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, Aman, did you find that it needs cities of a certain size to have sufficient demand to make it viable, or a certain sort of GDP, or did you have any ideas about cities where it works?
It's a very interesting question you pose here, because an interesting insight is the people in Sao Paulo are willing to pay average price more than in Singapore. It's a perception, it's a mindset of how we approach our lives, right? So that's the thing. But the positive to take here is that all of those average prices across those cities were above that profitability threshold that the suppliers were saying.
Mm.
Okay, so it could work well for developing country cities, not just mature economy cities.
Yes, it's good. And remember, and Andrew may have alluded to that previously also, eventually it's about, what's your trade-off that you're talking about, but also economies of scale are going to change the metric here. That is why, the 2040s are going to be more defining for this. And I have to say, probably I'm going to be late in the game in getting on them also. but yeah, it's by the time we believe that it is going to be viable for developing as well as developed set of cities. It may be a bit challenging for economies which don't have that kind of mature infrastructure. It may be limited to cities which are mature enough in terms of their infrastructure and overall ecosystem that's required. But it will be viable, and it will be demand and infrastructure-led kind of combination.
Mm. You won't be as dead as me, Aman, in 2040, I can assure you. I just want to pick up on one thing John said, which is the revenue opportunities arising from this. One of the things that's important, I think, in this is that if cities control their geodome, if you like, their space with what's called UTM, which is unmanned vehicle traffic management. When aeroplanes fly around, we have what's called ATM, which is air traffic management, which is stopping aeroplanes colliding with each other. Within a city, I think there's the capacity for each city to set up its own UTM space. And I think that is a revenue opportunity for cities. Suppliers will have to pay to get access, a little bit like charging taxes or road taxes or whatever today.
Yeah, Mr. John, you can see all the questions and you can cover them all, right?
Thank you very much. Yes, I think it was Mr. Venugopal who was asking about the financial viability of urban air mobility. I think we've kind of commented on that now. I think that's been very useful. The other questions I can see here are, I think there's a question from Almasa Aluni, and it says, in regard of the urban environment delivery, what about privacy, trespassing, and security issues on what to deliver? Andrew, do you have some views about managing privacy and data protection and security? What's your view in terms of regulation?
Absolutely. This is a role. This is a clear example of a role for cities to intervene and to make rules which are appropriate to that city. And it's also a clear case where I think we're going to need to have some prototypes. We're going to need to have some pioneering cities that get out there and see what their communities find acceptable. I also think, as a general comment, that over time we will find a new balance. I mean, remember when mobile telephones were first introduced, it was the height of bad manners to talk on them in public. Now we've developed all sorts of workarounds for that as well. So I think that it's going to take a little while, but I think that that's exactly the sort of situation where local government authorities ought to be involved.
You could relate
Very
to,
interesting.
what UK is doing
please.
in terms of. Apologies, John. Carry on.
No, please go ahead, Aman.
I was going to say, you can relate to some of the work that UK has been putting in terms of secure kind of technologies coming out there, and that's just a part of the puzzle. So secure by design is becoming faster kind of the way of doing things. I think secure by process is another layer that we'll start looking at coming in, which will be the data side of the things, and that will lead into things like, say, GDPR element of that and other kind of elements. So all these things are, as it is, becoming a norm in our digital lifestyles already. What requires to be done is that security layer from an aviation perspective just goes a tad higher in complexity to be achieved. But then you have elements of data, etc., which can be layered in. It's just about how it is approached. And Andrew is very right. This is where cities need to come in, the regulators need to come in to come up with some standardized architecture and structures and processes in place.
Yeah.
Thanks, Aman. Another question here is from Lulu Zhao. I hope I got the pronunciation close. Lulu is saying, why is it that manufacturers have chosen certain cities to operate? Do you guys have any examples of, why, we find drone operations currently taking place, or urban taxis are more likely to take place? There must be some triggers to their interest.
Well, Andrew will have more detail on it, right? But I think it's a combination of cities having the infrastructure that they can field it in, demand in their perspective, but also it's about relationships and presence. It's all these three things play into that kind of decision, I would say.
Yeah, it's a race for the suppliers to build the equipment. It's a race for cities to be amongst the leaders in having the equipment in their cities. So we're in a sort of a double-headed race. And exactly as Aman says, it's no surprise that Airbus is looking at Paris. It's no surprise that Lilium is looking at Berlin and other German cities. I mean, I think you can peel it back. Yihang in Guangzhou. I think you can peel it back and make some fairly obvious conclusions. Unfortunate, but nevertheless obvious conclusions.
Thanks, guys. One last question because of the time, if I may say. Michelle Capobianco is asking us, how do we see the short and medium-term opportunities for unmanned cargo transport? And when do you think that's going to become really commercially convenient and totally feasible? So unmanned cargo transportation.
I see the potential for unmanned cargo as huge, absolutely huge. And when's it going to become feasible? Well, it's about 10 minutes past 10 my time now. Frankly, any time now. I think that I think the vaccine and all that stuff is going to drive this really quite quickly now, and I think the uplift for those sorts of for uses will be enormous.
It's going to be the type of cargo at the end of the day we are talking about. So the element that we are talking about, the vaccine, etc., these special kind of missions are already, you've got NHS driving the services already, and rest of the world already doing that. You've seen the weight of many bigger kind of logistics kind of companies coming in play. I think it's the second one which will follow suit a bit later, but still cargo operations are going to be probably a bit before the passenger operations really are realized. And that's the complexity of regulations, etc. I think even the regulators would want to see these things flying and being proven successful before they start putting the passengers into it.
Yeah. I think that's very clear. If you put people on board, then you change the parameters altogether. And I also think there's a very interesting safety issue here, which is that instead of taking the safety threshold of the classic aviation threshold, I think we should be looking at, is this safer than having blokes in white vans driving around busy streets? And I think that's the sort of analysis we need to do.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you, Aman. I just want to thank Alexandra in the chat who mentions her company Musk Thrust. So everybody take a look at Musk Thrust. And also, I'm very pleased to see we have a message from the Free Economic Zone in Brest, Belarus. We definitely need to see more investment, maybe of this type, in Belarus as well for its markets. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Aman and Andrew, but thank you all for listening. I'm going to pass back to Karen to close the webinar for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our time is up. Thank you very much, Mr. John, Mr. Aman, and Mr. Andrew for conducting this insightful webinar. And I would like to thank also our audience for joining us and sharing their questions. So to the link in this webinar for today, the video and the presentation will be sent to you via email. So please do follow us on our social media channels to keep yourself updated. And thank you once again. Stay safe, everyone. Have a nice day. Bye.